Hi, my name is Lenny Abrahamson, and I'm very happy to be talking to you.
Lenny, how are you? Thanks so much for taking the time out of what must be a busy schedule with all the media around normal people at the moment. And I suppose, yeah, we'll get to that kind of in a few minutes. I kind of feel if we start talking there, that will be the entire.
It'll be the whole thing, yeah, absolutely.
So tell me, Lenny, as a young lad, was there a camera strapped to your shoulder from a very young age?
No, it's funny. I've read those biographies, and there were those filmmakers who were mad for cameras right from the start, and out in their back gardens filming their siblings in cowboy
Yeah,
movies and stuff. No, I wasn't. I wasn't. I was. I loved watching stuff. Um, and I was quite a sort of introspective kid. I mean, I was funny and so I wasn't always the shy one in the corner, but I was quite introspective, and I found television and film just like amazing, and would watch anything. So that was my kind of thing, but I wasn't running around with cameras. It was much later when I started to think about actually doing it myself.
and what was you kind of like? Were you kind of an avid film watcher as a kid? Like, would you kind of have a broad range of kind of?
Very much the stuff that you'd expect. I mean, there was something about sitting in front of a screen that I found like really reassuring and calming as a kid. And I remember like getting up really early on a Saturday morning when kids programs began at a certain time, and I'd be there for like an hour before with the telly on. But then, yeah, and then seeing films, they definitely like even films, the classic Christmas stuff like Chitty Chitty Bang Bang and all those things that they show. I would just completely enter into it, and I found they had like I was tuned into it. I suppose like lots of kids are, mine are. But it was probably a little bit later, like when I was in my teens, that I saw like started to see, just have a chance to see like a broader range of great American films and also European films, and realized that there was this whole kind of world of uh, of ideas and aesthetics and different tones, and because I was a reader and I read novels and I was interested in ideas, and I was quite sort of cerebral,
Mm.
and hadn't connected this like the purely experiential quality of watching films as a kid with the kind of things that a book could do to your brain. That connection happened more like mid to late teens, and then I thought, oh my god, what an incredible fusion of the performative and musical and rhythmic art that film is on one hand, and also literary, intellectual. Like there's just this incredible vast range within it, and that's when I got like sort of thought, oh my god, what would it be like to actually be involved in that?
And that's fascinating because I mean I think you can kind of get a sense of that through a lot of your work. You know, that kind of that space, that kind of cerebral, emotional, and the place where they join. And was there a sense, because didn't you go and study something fairly niche? And there was some
Yeah,
theoretical physics kind of.
yeah.
Yeah. How did that come
Yeah.
about? Sorry.
I did that because, right, so there's two reasons. I just happened to have in my school, there happened to be, the way there'd just be a couple of great teachers in any school. And the teachers that I really loved was a guy called Tony Kelly, another man called John Hickey. Those two men were really brilliant teachers. They just were great. One taught maths, the other taught applied maths and chemistry, and I just really loved it. So I also was kind of probably insufferable in the sense that I was somehow convinced myself that the most important thing in the world was to be clever. I think it's a family thing as well. It's definitely in the family. And so I thought, what's the hardest thing? What's the thing you do that when you tell people what you're studying, they go, woo. So I think the combination of having great teachers and that kind of appalling, precocious idiot that I was put me into that. And it took me a year or two to realize that it wasn't my thing. I mean, I really thought it was fascinating, but I wasn't brilliant at it. Like there were people in the class who I thought, okay, that's what you're born to do. I think my interest was in ideas in a slightly different space. And so I changed from that and I did philosophy, which I really, really enjoyed and did a lot for me. But at that point, I was also, I was connected back with Ed Guiney, who I'd known since we were teenagers.
Oh, I was going to ask you, like, what was it
Yeah.
back then? Okay.
So we knew each other because we both come from kind of leafy South Dublin suburbs, which and we both went to I went to the high school in sort of Rathgar, and Ed went to Gonzaga, and there would be the odd kind of social. There'd be a party, like girls would have a party from a girls' school or whatever that would know. My sister knew some of the kids that went to whatever, the usual. So I met Ed when we were about 14 or 15, and we were both fascinated with film. We just used to talk about it all the time. And then in college, he said, why don't we set up this? Why don't we set up a filmmaking society? Not just like watching stuff, or why don't we use, start to try and do things? And that's what happened. So that's when, and at the same time as I was studying philosophy, I was kind of that's when I started to play with cameras.
Okay. And then, I mean, going back to when yourself and Ed were kind of that kind of 14, 15, 16, what was it kind of, always, when you kind of have a friend that you're growing up with and you can bounce those rabbit holes, do you know what I mean? The combinations that can go further than your normal kind of sort of.
Yes.
Did that kind of happen with Perry's?
Yes, it did. It happened with Ed, and it happened also with Stephen Rennicks, who's the composer that has done everything I've done. So Stephen, we go back to primary school, and he was that friend that we would talk about everything. And there were a couple other friends as well who have drifted in and out of this world, but were also very important. So yeah, that was it. That was the sort of the start. And actually, I'm still working with those two in particular, but others as well.
And then in Trinity, like the idea, I suppose, of, I mean, everyone talks about, players and, different societies, but the fact of setting one up yourselves, I mean, that's kind of, that's it, it is a big jump. It's even though if you're interested in something, it's kind of about them bringing other people around you, which is different.
That's Ed, you see, because I would have just sat there thinking about it and pondering it and probably wouldn't have done anything about it.
Right.
And I was very close friends with Michael West.
Yeah.
Who's another person who's another person I could share ideas with. And he's so he wrote Three Joes, which was the first thing that we all did. But actually, I would have sat around thinking about it. Ed is the one who goes, here is a thing that we could do that would be really exciting. And he goes about doing it. And that's entirely remained the relationship.
It's so funny that they give you right even back to like 15, 14, to have the, to kind of set out your,
have that kind of that make it happen sort of ability, as well as great taste and insight.
Yeah.
And so you definitely, I would have farted my time away had I not met Ed in that way.
And talk to me about the Three Joes, because I mean, within that, because of his time, I mean, obviously, Michael West, and there was, the Dominic West was involved in it, and Michael Murphy. And how did that all kind of happen? I mean, how did you end up being the one that was doing that?
That's really interesting. In fact, the thing that that is, it's a really interesting thing that you asked that question. How was I the one who directed it? I sort of just at some point decided that I would love to direct. And that's what I talked to Ed about from like 16, 17. And he'd always wanted to produce. And then when we set up this thing, it was almost like, who wants to be the director? I'll put my hand up. And we did a few little things before Three Joes, and I had directed them. And I think that was it. It was almost like saying, I'll go and goal, I'll play center forward. So it does take a little bit of sort of self-assertion at some level to have that, to sort of have the instinct that you should do that. And even though at the beginning you're sort of playing at being in that role, that's the way we all are. And then you gradually actually become the person that you're playing at, which I think is a thing, actually Ed's talked about that, but I think it's a thing that everybody can look back on, is the point at which you sort of realize, oh, how bizarre. People look at me like I am this thing now, when for so long I was kind of trying to suppress a smile. Or I would never say I was a filmmaker. I even remember there's a thing called the director's viewfinder, which you don't use anymore because there's brilliant apps on your mobile phone, which can, it mimics the lenses. So if you're choosing a shot, you can go around and do this thing. I always like thought, wow, imagine having one of those around your neck. But I didn't, and I made hundreds of TV commercials, but I didn't buy one of those until I made a film. I just couldn't. I couldn't even, you know. So that idea of sort of saying that's what I am, but at some level, I put my hand up in college and stayed that way.
And was it duck to water for you? I mean, like in a kind of skill set, or in a kind of did you find that fusion even at a very basic level?
I mean, I think when I finally made Three Joes, which was the first sort of drama we'd done, I felt like I did understand, or had a good understanding of how shots fit together. And I realized that I watched so much stuff and read so much stuff. And that when I was on the set and I talked to people, I felt good. It felt like it knackered me. I mean, when I think about that, I'd say that I was as tired after shooting for like 4 days or whatever it was on Three Joes as I am now at the end of like a full project. Because it's like a maths exam where I remember dreaming about the shots and waking up afraid that I'd forgotten to do something or whatever. But yeah, I did feel like this, I felt really excited, and I felt like sort of at home in a way where you don't know until you do it, whether that's going to be the feeling you have.
And then, was it then kind of Stanford? Was it kind of around that time you kind of went to the States?
Yes. So I was still doing philosophy, and I really did love that. I mean, I really did. And I thought, well, I'll be interested to see, I'll apply for scholarships to see if I could go to the States. But there was a year gap, and that's when we made Three Joes.
Yeah.
So I thought, like, I'm not going to go straight away. I'll take a year and try and do a bit of stuff and work on bits and apply for college in the States to see. And during that year, we made Three Joes, and then I got accepted to a few places, and one of them was Stanford, and I decided to go just because I thought it would be, I think I kind of knew in my heart, even when I went, that I wouldn't stay the course. It was a 5-year PhD course. I mean, massive commitment of time. And I'd already, just having been on set, I think I was gone then. And then when I was there, the film started to do okay, you know, like for an Irish short at that time. And we were pretty much, like maybe 2 shorts were made that year and no features. I mean, it was dead, you know. And I remember being over there sitting in my little place writing an essay, and Ed and the gang ringing me from, I don't know, Cork. We won the European Short Film Award at Cork. And that was like, we just couldn't believe it. And I just thought, why am I here? They're all having such a good time. And that's when I chucked it in.
How long were you there for?
I was only there for really half a year. I mean, I wasn't happy there. I think it would have taken me a year or two to settle in. But I think I knew that much as I enjoyed the thinking and the stimulation of it, it wasn't a life that I was going to be happy in. I need a bit of madness. I need to have like conversations with all sorts of different people. I like the weird, eclectic sort of relationships that you form making things. And I like the fact that you're talking to people and not just other academics or specialists. You're talking to other human beings.
And how did that frame with you, kind of your go-getter, wanting to be top of the toppermost?
Well, oh yeah, that's a really good question, because that was the point at which I jumped off that train.
Yeah.
And you know, I had like a full scholarship for 5 years there. It was, you know, and it's outrageously expensive to be in an elite American college. Nobody can afford it unless you're super rich or get a scholarship. So it was an amazing thing to have, and to just go, do you know what, I'm not going to do this. And then I came back and I did, and very necessarily, I think I had a bit of a crisis, probably for about 3 or 4 years, where I wrote some stuff, never happy with it, and tried to do the thing, be a filmmaker, write something brilliant, and actually realizing that I was sort of so caught up in this thing of needing to be brilliant that it was stifling and crippling. And I think that was a very important like lesson in just being you know, not doing that to yourself. And what I did was, having thought to myself, unless I make now a work of, you know, world historic genius, it's a complete failure, and I've done a really stupid thing that like just crippled me. Of course it did. And I realized that actually after those few years that I had to just drop all that. And in fact, I went not quite the other way, because that's not fair on what I'm about to say I did. But I thought, no, how about I just take whatever work I can get and start shooting things?
Mm.
And I realized, so I very luckily, with a wonderful man called Johnny Spears, got into doing TV commercials, because I also was broke and I needed to make a living. And then I thought, I need to be making things. I need to be shooting stuff. And I realized after a while, and I turned out to do well in that, I realized that what had happened really was that I was just afraid when I came back. And in a way, all those massive kind of ideals about, how brilliant, all all the sort of mainstream stuff is crap. I have to transcend all that. That's really a guarantee that you're not going to do anything. It's a way of letting yourself off the hook.
Yeah.
And actually, just the humility of saying, no, I'm going to start shooting and see if I'm really any good at this. I've made basically one short, and I've thrown my life at this now.
Yeah.
So let's have a look and see if I'm any good. And it was a confidence boosting thing in the end.
I mean, I think it's fascinating, because you two things about that. I mean, back when the Three Joes started to pop, I mean, for people kind of who exist in this kind of era that we're in now, when Irish film was exploding in TV and whatever, but like back, there was nothing at all, and I think that goes without saying, to have your first short kind of receive that amount of praise is kind of a huge thing.
Yeah. And some of that was outside the country, which of course at that time, and you'll know, I always say this to people who are younger now, it's a brilliant thing that people don't quite understand this, but we definitely had a sort of inferiority complex. And you needed somebody in the UK or America, ideally America, or, Europe, to tell you that you were any good for yourself, and indeed for the culture generally in Ireland to take you seriously.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that that's gone.
And come here, then tell us, I mean, you did some amazing commercials. You got a huge amount of work, and your work was very, popular is the wrong phrase, but it struck, the zeitgeist. Like, what sort of ones did you do around that time, Lenny?
Well, I started off with sort of various ones, and did like things for the lottery and whatever. And then the ones that everybody would probably remember were, I did these ones for Carlsberg, which actually ended up being international commercials. So they were, Carlsberg doesn't do dreams, but if they did, they'd probably be the best dreams. And that was the Jason McAteer winning the World Cup one. And I did the one really fancy one where these guys go to a nightclub, which is just the dream nightclub, and loads of taxis outside and all that stuff. So I did those ones. I did some lovely ones for the Irish Times, very low key ones. Actually did one with Brian O'Driscoll when he was about 19, and he just scored a hat trick against France.
Yes.
And he came out on set, and was just a lovely guy. So yeah, did a bunch of those, and traveled a bit with commercials as well. Yeah. And stayed in them too long, but at the same time, I'm thankful for all the work I got and the what I learned.
But the nuts and bolts of being on a set, being on different types of sets and being under that kind of commercial pressure must have been a huge kind of learning for you as well.
Absolutely. And I didn't go to film school, but I did hundreds and hundreds of commercials. And each time you do one, it's taking a project from start to finish. There's a client, there's money, there's a crew, it has to fit this time. It's quite, all of that, all of it's really useful. And I got to use all this equipment and work with really amazing crews, get your flying hours, basically. You just, and with that comes a certain confidence when you then go back to your own work. And also maybe takes the pressure off showing off, because you get to show off a bit in commercials, technique wise. So you don't feel you have to do that in the drama.
Yeah. And come here, was yourself and Ed then? Were you kind of still kind of working or bouncing things together around that time?
So when I came back from Stanford, Ed, of course, had, in Ed's way, just continued his brilliant career. And he was, I think at that stage, he might have formed a company with Stephen Bradley called Temple Pictures. I'm trying to think when that was. And Ed made a film with Paddy Branagh called Ailsa, Joe O'Connor, story and script. And, Damien O'Donnell were making, and I was sitting at home getting more and more freaked out that I'd made the mistake and was never going to do anything. And Ed the door was always open. But I wasn't happy with what I was. We did submit, so I got some support from the Arts Council and everything. But then Johnny Spears, the guy that did Three Joes with me, the guy who did the commercials with me, he ended up meeting Mark O'Halloran, and it was through Johnny, and Johnny produced with Ed, executive producing the first feature.
Okay.
So he plays a part in it, very much so at that point as well.
And how did, like, talk to me about that kind of coming together of those elements towards Adam and Paul? Like, how, you know?
Definitely meeting Mark was a major sort of moment for me, because that resistance was still in me to stepping out, in a way that I'd managed to shift out of my home and bedroom to do commercials, but I was still resisting what I really wanted to do. And Johnny met Mark and asked him if he had ideas for films. He'd seen a play that Mark had done in Bewley's, and Mark gathered all the stuff that he had, and one of it was like an outline and some sample scenes about these two characters, Adam and Paul. And Johnny had given me this envelope, and I read through all of Mark's ideas, and that just jumped. This bit of dialogue particularly jumped at me. And it triggered all these things. Like, the story ended up changing radically, but the characters stayed exactly the same. And the pattern of dialogue and Mark's genius for that kind of music. And what it tripped in me was this deep love of slapstick, which I had from being a kid and watching Laurel and Hardy, and a kind of pathos that's in that, mixed with a different kind of more realist impulse. And it was just, I could taste exactly how the film would feel from the moment I read about 4 or 5 lines. And I met Mark, and we just like talked each other to death at that point. And we worked on the outline. That shifted a lot. And I think the only thing I can take credit for there is just telling Mark, you don't need all this plot. You don't need a kind of a Jeopardy situation with a gangster character or whatever it was. You just lean into this incredible writing that you can do. And it can be episodic, and it can be odd, and it can be sort of that Scandinavian existential comedy that I love, like Aki Kaurismäki and people like that. And we just watched movies talked. Mark wrote. We'd sit down together and do little bits of rearranging. And that's where Adam and Paul came from. And it was a joyous collaboration.
Can you talk to me a bit about that, the smelling and the feeling and the emotion and the visual of it after reading it? Because that's something that fascinates in relation to, you know, obviously, you know, there's a whole storyboarding process and the whole kind of bashing things together process.
Yeah.
But how you arrive back again at a feeling that you had, that must be an extraordinary challenge, but also an extraordinary. It's nearly like writing a score or like writing a.
Yeah, it's like doing the. Sometimes I think about it like doing the music to somebody else's libretto. It's like opera or something like that. In that case, where that is the biggest question that faces you when you're kind of, is how do you go from this? If you're lucky, you get this burst of like this 3-dimensional kind of thing that happens in your head, for me, which is a feeling, a sense of tone. And actually, it's just, I can really imagine the way the characters will occupy the screen, that how time will pass in the scene, how dialogue shouldn't work, what will and won't work within that tonal space. And it's a musical instinct of some kind that aligns with the meanings and the themes. And the hardest thing is maintaining that through the relentlessly practical and messy process of making something. So I tend not to over pre-visualize. I don't do storyboards. I do small shot diagrams for myself in my own weird little system. And then I let that be there on the day, but I also change things, because somehow if you've got to be chasing that little spark that isn't just a kind of mechanical outline of something. It's got to be alive, and that you only find that on the day, for me anyway. And there are times when the thing shoots exactly as you've imagined it, and there are times where you go quite far from it, but always you're trying to not let that kind of feeling go. And it's really hard, because as soon as you get in a room and you're talking about logistics and stuff, you can't always call up, all of that kind of odd bag of stuff that is what the heart of the project should be. That's the challenge.
And then I suppose I suppose the relationship then with an editing process must be huge for that. I mean, obviously it's huge
Yeah.
for every filmmaker, but just in that space and finding that.
Yeah, so you kind of, I mean, you make it again in the edit, and what you find, if you're lucky, is that the rushes contain, if you interrogate them hard enough, that the rushes contain the thing that you went into them looking for.
Yeah.
And you have to extract that out. So editing is a sort of mining, you know? You produce at the first two phases, like you produce script and all that, and then you produce shots and rushes and sound in the second. And then the mining process comes. You assemble something, you think, well, that's what we did. And for a while you think, yeah, that's okay, or it's awful, whatever you think, but it's what it is. And then you realize, no, there's a whole other level to go to where you can find things that are in the material that you didn't consciously put there, or that the actor did something, or that there is a better way of conceiving of this. And so editing is odd. It's like a jigsaw where you can continually slightly remake the picture and the pieces. So in that sense, it's not like a jigsaw. It's a bad analogy, although people think of it like that. You're just putting things together. You're not. You've got to just treat this material like you didn't know anything about it, and be prepared to find ways of improving it and making it richer, to find that moment. And I remember with Garage, I worked with a great editor called Isabel Stevenson on Garage. At the very last phase of editing for months and months and months, and we took minutes, maybe 10 minutes out of the film with days to go to the lock picture. And that's when it came alive. It was like it took us that long to find, bang, that cut just absolutely tunes the string, you know? It's like a guitar string. It's plonking, plonking, and then you just tighten it, and suddenly you find the note. And that note, if you're lucky, is something like the thing you felt at the very, very beginning.
And can I ask a kind of question I ask an awful lot of theatre directors, and kind of being one myself, is kind of how are you at letting things go, at kind of going, that's it? Or, you know, is that a difficult process?
You know, I used to be better at it because I had no choice. You know, especially in those days where it was harder to unpick things once you decided. These days, you know, there's this thing called lock, which is supposed to be the point at which no changes are made to picture, because everybody else got to get involved, sound, composers, everything, and they want this template. But I always just say, well, unless it is actually impossible to do it, which I've never yet come to a point where it is, if we know there is a way of making this better and it's possible to do it, we just have to do it. So we now call it soft lock. It's a totally meaningless phrase. So now I'm much worse at letting things go.
Just go back to Adam and Paul for a second. I mean, I think nothing like that was kind of seen before in relation to, say, the context of very urban and, you know, kind of, you know, that context, but also the grace and the beauty, bizarrely, that was kind of found. Yes. And obviously the 2 Cent Mark and Tom, the two central characters, were just extraordinary, and kind of lives very much, and all the surrounding pieces. But I mean, I suppose that kind of, that work seems to feed or bleed through an awful lot of your kind of work since then. You know, I mean, I'm kind of jumping now, but like Work Like Prosperity, excuse me.
Yeah.
And actually, in some ways, even through Normal People, and certainly in kind of that kind of social constructs that people live in. Is that something that kind of had fascinated?
Yeah, I mean, what fascinates me ultimately is the sort of feeling of reality, or of heightened reality, that you can achieve in film. And of course, then the question is, what in the service of what, and what is it that you're showing? But the actual, like the moment of sort of the music, if you like, because it's what's so amazing about music is it has no semantic, like there's no, you know, you can't, it's not directly talking about anything. And the interplay of that sense of kind of, I don't know, a held breath and a thing which is so alive that you can't believe it, with something that is about human frailty and the kind of need of a person, that combination is incredibly powerful. And with Adam and Paul, I think what I felt like, honestly, from the moment I read that like page of dialogue, was that, because actually, if you think about Adam and Paul, what could it have been? It could so easily have been like, there's nothing radical about seeing two, um, like hardshore, potentially messy blokes. It's like classic comedy, everything from Joxer and the Captain to, you've got all that, and every double act. What was interesting about it really was the kind of delicacy and sadness and sort of lostness and childlikeness of the characters, plus the combination of Mark's writing and the sort of somewhat deliberate and almost theatrical aspects to the way that it was shot, made you feel about this, allowed you to feel about these characters in a different and slightly deeper way, and it got you past the way that you might traditionally just think about those guys.
But I think that's a really radical, in a bizarre way, radical positioning on those guys. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
And I think, even the response to it at the time, and certainly the response to it now from, and also an awful lot of other people that work in sort of the live arts, or kind of, in the performing arts. I think what's interesting, Lenny, what you said about your work there, is that there's aliveness. And I think that's kind of that you seek. And I think,
yes, definitely.
Like, and that's really interesting. And how then, like, okay, you make your first big feature and it does really well, and it kind of gets, it gets awards, and here we go, and now I'm here, and I'm making and then, Garage, which is similar actually not in its aesthetics, but in the kind of rural sense.
Yes.
But is an extraordinary piece of character study as well. How did that come about? Well,
actually, we were so unprepared for Adam and Paul to sort of reach an audience and for people to really like it, that we were we hadn't sort of thought about what was next. That was just so all-consuming. And myself and Mark wanted to work together again for sure. And we did try something in the middle. It was a really good project, but we never got there with it. And then one day we were talking, and Mark told me about this character that had been a person he remembered from his childhood in Ennis. And it was because he had, like, a few weeks earlier, just happened to say to his mum, whatever happened to this guy. And his mum told him a story that was not a million miles away from Garage. And both of us just felt it is a perfect encapsulation of so many things. And it's also a kind of, the imperative we felt was to, like, do justice to that person's life. A little bit like Adam and Paul, in the sense that you're taking people who are overlooked, or you're taking people who are very easily put into a kind of box.
Yeah.
And you're saying, well, let's celebrate this person. And let's chronicle their lives in a way which gives back the weight of the life. And we both felt that very much, and that idea that it would just take place over a bunch of days that looked very much like each other, that was there from the beginning. And I think when Mark told me that story and we both started talking about it, it became just alive and absolutely sort of clear at that point. And, and that was an amazing one as well. And I remember then Pat Short as the person to play it. That was another great sort of moment of going, Jesus, that would be incredible. And I'd worked with him on Aircom commercials, but I do remember him sitting there late at night, really tired, on a commercials shoot that went on forever, and just the sort of look of exhaustion and sadness, and actually realizing that Pat had the other side of the clowning, that the dark and the sad and the tender side of clowning was all there. And that's what Josie is. It's not actually, people go, oh my God, how would you have ever thought of somebody like Pat Short? And actually, I should say, Mark and I still can't agree on who thought of him first. I think it was me. He thinks it was him. But anyway, and I'm very good at giving credit, so I'm pretty sure it was me. But anyway, he can come on and say the opposite. But I think people will say, oh, what a genius piece of casting, because, you never would have thought of this straight dramatic role. This is this guy who does Unbelievables and everything. First of all, Pat had done, great theatre work, straight theatre somewhat. But also, it is clowning. It's just turned right down to nearly zero. and it's clowning around the saddest and the sort of loneliest things, but Josie still is like from that tradition, I think, that Pat is in.
I mean, it's interesting because you look at all the kind of the huge amount of TV series in the UK kind of made over the last number of years about that kind of messy side of working classes, or that kind of and it's fascinating because whatever, Garage is 13 years ago, but that sense of what I always found fascinating about those two films is and the clowning thing is kind of a huge part of it, but also it's kind of it's rural, but it's not, it's very much in that kind of working class rural messy pub situation. And that again is kind of and also it's kind of like that aesthetic of, I think it does kind of in some ways what Paris, Texas did to certain parts of America, to the Irish landscape. And I think that really is interesting, Lenny, that kind of approach of putting those characters in that kind of pub scenario.
Yeah, because it's not, it's the opposite of what we were really inclined to do here for a long time, which was lonely bachelor farmer, the soil, totally monosyllabic. And then usually a woman would come into the scene and it would be about, and it would be highly, ultimately melodramatic, albeit very sort of quietly melodramatic.
Yeah.
And I just never found that compelling. I didn't believe that the people telling the stories kind of even believed this. Of course, those lives were lived, but I think that way of looking at those lives is from an earlier period. It was dead by the time I was coming around, and it was dead as a form because everybody done it, and it just felt like, terribly po-faced.
Yeah.
Whereas Josie can't stop talking. He's sort of vaguely idiotic in lots of ways. There's no sort of dignified darkness in it. The darkness is really there, but it's not sort of presented in that strong black and white photography sort of way. And the town is a town, and it's a bit shite in lots of ways, but also has its positives. And like Anne-Marie Duff's character and her sister is exactly what you would get, as you say, in a working class urban story. I haven't actually thought about it like that, Mark, but that's a very good way to think about it. And actually then finding that, shooting in the Midlands, I loved that. Not going with the hill farms but going instead with just this flat, beautiful, like, I didn't realize that's the part of Ireland I had driven through, and it is magnificent.
Yeah.
Tip and East Galway and all of that, beautiful. And that felt just like, I mean, every time it's such a privilege to do, because every time you get to do something like that, you can inhabit that other space and just find it. You never would have spent time there if I hadn't been shooting.
And around that time, I mean, that must have been a very busy time. Was it Prosperity around that time as well?
Yeah, so there was a bit of a gap between Adam and Paul and Garage.
Yeah.
And then then Prosperity came very quickly. And that was great because it was like it sort of grew out of Adam and Paul. Mark had all these stories about what might happen to other characters always. He's great for that. And Georgie was the one that he sort of thought most about. Because Georgie, he's only in it for about, I think you see him in the pub again, absolutely locked at the end of the day because it's gone. He had that one can in the park, and that was the end. And then that idea of doing 4 stories, and RTE amazingly commissioning it. I wish they'd show it again. There's no way of seeing it. But
it's extraordinary. I mean, it's funny you mentioned Georgie because. Well, there's a couple of things. I mean, that was made at the point where the crash was about to kind of really happen. And, an awful lot of the situations those characters were in were about to become way more prevalent in kind of people who would not have expected to be in those social situations.
Yeah.
But I think Georgie, I mean, as a thread from Adam and Paul, I still remember vividly the quiet horror of that man's life.
Oh, yeah.
And yet the empathy, which is extraordinary. I mean,
it's funny, like a brilliant line that only Mark could have written is when he's sitting in the welfare office and the guy says, "Ah, you need to go out," and I can't remember what the line is that provokes it, and says, "You know, you need to do this or whatever," and you know, and Georgie just looks at him and says, "I'm 42. I'm 40 fucking two," and that is such. I mean, that line's got more poignant with me as I go into my 50s. By the way,
Yeah, yeah.
you know, because that's 42 now seems. What's he
No.
complaining about? But it's such a great line, yeah, and that the desperation of it, and with his son and his mother, and yeah, it's beautiful writing. I mean, it's funny with Adam and Paul feels to me, and Garage feel to me like perfect kind of collaborations of like equal, like I feel equal creative ownership on both those projects goes to Mark and goes to me. On Prosperity, I feel I shot them pretty simply, and I feel like that's like 60-40 to Mark, because it's just the writing is just everything in those 4 episodes. Maybe 70-30 even, I would say.
And then there was a kind of a, you know, a kind of, not a gear shift, but a kind of, you know, obviously then you were known. You were kind of, you know,
yeah,
you were that filmmaker you always wanted to be. You'd won a
yeah.
You know, obviously opportunities were kind of, you know, but I suppose I think for those who don't work in the arts, or particularly don't work in film, is how long projects take, no matter who you are, how long projects take to get up off the ground. But then, like what Richard did, kind of, you know, shifted, you know, whatever kind of, you know, working class rural, you know, working class Dublin. This was a whole new dynamic, which was fascinating to see through your lens.
Yeah, it was important to me that that I wanted to be clear what attracted me to doing that, because I was working on, I think I was working on Frank for quite a while before I did what Richard did, and I was also trying to get room even from back then.
Okay.
And as so often happens, Ed said, "Read this novel," and it was Kevin Power's novel, Bad Day at Black Rock. And I really enjoyed the novel, but I sort of felt it was from everybody's point of view, and it was I don't know, there were aspects of it that I really was interested in, but I think I said to Ed that I was interested particularly in this character of Richard, who was the perpetrator, and I thought for me the most interesting thing would be to extract him. And I wasn't sure, I didn't know, I thought I would perhaps just wait and make Frank. But Ed said, "I think there's something really in this." And I thought about it, and I hooked up with a great writer called Malcolm Campbell. And we started to work on it, and I was very keen that, well, 2 things. First of all, I was, what I think really persuaded me in the end to say, yes, there's something in this, was my sort of thing that I didn't want to be, I'm not a Ken Loach sort of filmmaker. It's about a certain kind of seeing behind that I'm always interested in. And taking taking actually the character who's probably most despised, which is the self-entitled middle class character, was even more challenging in a way than taking Adam and Paul or Josie.
Yeah.
Like there's a long history of noble presentations of the despised, but in a way, like the dangerous one is the privileged character. And I remember thinking about people I'd been in school with who had been sort of loved universally by other boys, particularly. Like they were just the alpha, but not the pain in the arse one, but the one who the parents loved as well. The one who felt like they go on and occupy a leading position in society, but in a good sort of noblesse oblige sort of way.
Yeah.
I thought that's a really precarious position to be in psychologically. So that appealed to me, and it appealed to me to do something different. And it was the first thing I was going to do without Mark. And that was quite a thing as well. But started working with Malk, and then had this idea that the only way we could do this really authentically was to start talking to people who were really from that world. And that's when we cast it. We cast it a year before we made it. And most of the stories, most of the script, lots of the script came out of conversations we had with the cast. And that was a brilliant way of working, you know? And it was important to me as well to, you know, everything I'd done had been so wrapped up with me and Mark. But I think probably for both of us, it was important to confirm that we could live without each other, you know, and make work without each other.
And that also sense of you occupying the space you grew up in as well. I mean, you know,
Yeah.
was that a kind of like, oh Jesus, you know, that's difficult in some ways. I mean, I'm not.
Well, it is difficult because somehow it can be easier to see things that are not close to you. You know, it can be easier to see those clearly. And when something is close to you, now I have a different, I mean, my background is on one hand, right, like just like that.
Yeah.
Although I didn't go to as fancy a school as
Yeah, no,
when you imagine them going to, but at the same time, and also coming from like an ethnically different background bit, you know, I was always sort of somewhat on, you know, I occupied unusual territory as well. Having said that, that was my world. Yeah. I went to schools, rugby matches. I wasn't a good player, but a lot of my friends were. Stephen Rennicks, the composer, was a superb athlete. Like he could, you know, he was a really good rugby player. All of those things. So I did know that world.
But I think, sorry, I probably phrased that incorrectly. I think yeah, a world that you are occupied in the broader sense rather than
yes, world that I had been adjacent to for sure. Yeah.
But I think it's funny, you can be part of many different worlds or be perceived to be, but actually not actually being
Well,
in it.
that's it. Isn't that the intersectionality sort of idea that we all cross in different ways?
Yeah. And I suppose again, to jump forward, to jump back, I'm kind of interested in Frank in a bizarre way. I mean, I absolutely adore Frank. I think it's one of my favorite ever films. But I just think that in a bizarre way, the exploration of the male is threads across a lot of your work.
Yeah.
And not in a way, and not in a kind of a maleness way, but just that kind of the feeling of it, rather than the exposition of it. And
yes, exactly. That's really interesting, and that's certainly true in Frank, and in what Richard did. And actually, there's like you can see John as a kind of comedic flip side of those of what it is to sort of think you need to be special in some way, and that competitive, terribly kind of humiliatingly competitive John is. So John is like my fear. John is the fear. John is precisely who I was afraid I was when I came back from Stanford and decided I was going to be a great artist. That is precisely who I was. Or I was afraid I was. I was afraid I was somebody with no talent who had done something like, just like you might go into theoretical physics, who thinks, no, I'll be a film director. Like, Jesus, you know. And I really did. I really didn't know in those few years whether I was in fact just a complete imposter.
And Kabir, you said you were chasing Frank for a while. What was it about it?
Well, I was actually, so I got offered Frank. It's the only one that's ever come in the way, like from outside, that I said yes to. And I said no to it first of all because I thought, are you insane? Like, there's no way in the world this could be just such an awful kind of, like, what's the word? Quirky, that terrible word. It could just be, it could be the worst thing ever. But it's the slapstick thing again. It's the slapstick pathos that's there, and brilliant people, John Ronson and Peter Strahan. And they were very open because it used to be set in the 80s. It was quite a different story in some respects. And so I was able to be part of it from an early enough stage to be able to sort of bring some of my ideas into the shape of the story.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't so much, I was on it, but it was going to take a while to get it right and to, you know, and the question is, so what Richard did came about as a sort of, okay, and Ed is just great because he just said, no, you may, and I used to say things like, well, we'll explore what Richard did. It wasn't even called that then. We'll explore it. And sure, I can always, you know, not do it. And Ed would always say, of course, you can. Up until the point where we were past the point of no return, it's like the event horizon in the black hole goes, oh, fuck it. I'm really doing it.
And then sort of, I mean, I think the great thing about Frank, and we mentioned a lot, so I won't kind of dwell on it, is that kind of, comedic is the wrong word, but that kind of sense of, I suppose in a way, that great challenge of giving character to a faceless, or, you know, or
to a dead face, yeah.
And it's extraordinary. I mean, it really, really is. I mean,
I don't take credit. I take credit for believing that would work.
Yeah.
But I don't take credit for the phenomenon itself. Is like that's what human beings do. You know, we interpret. We are constantly, you know, projecting, and so it's those old experiments which I talked about before, where they show a face of somebody, and then they show something nice, like children picking daisies, and
Yeah.
people say the face expresses calm, pleasure. They show the same shot, and then something awful like animals killing each other, and the face expresses horror. So we do it, and it was manipulating that, and that was like a great exercise in filmmaking. And it's referenced internally as well, with when he points to himself and talks about his facial expressions.
So,
but it was,
and for you, was that again having moved away, having kind of changed your team or some of your team from like garage, what Richard did, and kind of now again a big jump from working from an intake point of view? Was that a whole new kind of vista for you as well?
Yeah, well, it was a little bit bigger than the things that I'd done before, and it obviously involved stars and things like that, or people who are very famous, and it was good, because it's another thing that tests you. I do enjoy the challenge of things, and each project has had its challenge. What Richard did, certainly very kind of potentially unlikable character, and the climax of the story being in the middle of the story. And that's something I did then in Room again, but I always quite interested in those stories of two halves, and Frank a little bit as well, but Frank then going into the realm of the kind of high comedic in a way, that was another challenge, and dealing with this mask and music filmed live, like just a nightmare. I mean, nothing I've done is harder than, like, nothing I've ever done is as hard as Frank, I would say.
Yeah, I can imagine the sound on Frank was an interesting,
brilliant man called Niall O'Sullivan, who was both the location sound mixer and the recording studio on-site recording studio person. I thought he was going to die. There was a point I thought he's going to have a heart attack. I've never seen a human being so stressed.
And then, like, suppose the next part is the part that kind of goes boom in relation to. I mean, sorry, what I mean is boom.
Yeah, from an external point of view.
After the fact. I mean, I suppose when you said you've been kind of trying to get Room up, what was it about Room, Lenny, that kind of you wanted to do it?
Well, that was another one which was like Adam and Paul, where I read the first like 20 pages of Room and went, I so get this at every. It was like a thing where you go, I don't know what they talk about, people who can do hard maths problems and they just see the answer.
Yeah.
That was a moment for me where I could see it. I could see what Emma had done. Such a brilliant thing she'd done, but I could see it and I could feel it, and I could see an image of the two of them with their heads on the pillow in the room. And I knew how it would feel, and I knew that the whole film would flow out of that image for me in a way that I felt rock solid with it. And it's a really hard thing to make, but I sort of felt I could make it.
Yeah, I mean, it's extraordinary, because when obviously I'd read the book, and it's such an internal piece, and even it's a shock in the book when it opens out, when you kind of, and I suppose that the method of capturing that was brilliant, the way that was kind of, I suppose for you having, I mean, that, how did that kind of happen in relation to the people becoming attached to it, and kind of, how did you manage, not how did you manage it, but like, that sense of you holding on to what you wanted to make? Yeah.
So the first thing was like, how do I get to do it? And that's what took so long. And I and that was building a relationship with Emma, and when that, like, I don't know who they were, but like Danny Boyle and all sorts of Spielberg, or who was telling me, there was, I don't know if it was Spielberg, but Ed mentioned a list of people that had been approaching Emma. Well, I had made Garage and Adam and Paul at that point. That was all that was out in the world, and Prosperity.
Yeah.
So leaving that aside, because that's just the story of how we get it, but I was just holding on to those images and that feeling that I knew could be there, and then picking people to work with really carefully. And I even remember a really crucial moment when we were close to making it. And it was a long script development process. It was lovely with Emma, and that was a way of continually refining it and going, does this fit this picture? Does it still fit that tone or not? And how will it work afterwards? The biggest challenge, how do you keep the viewers deeply connected to this after they escape? Because that's the bit where most films would end.
Yeah.
But the other thing was, like, I remember this crucial moment, and there are always these moments. I worked with Danny Cohen, who's a great cinematographer, and he did you know, the King's Speech and Les Mis and all sorts of huge big things and lots of stuff. And Ethan Tobin, this designer, and we were all three of us in Canada getting ready to shoot, but weeks and weeks and weeks out. And we said, are we really going to shoot in a room this small? None of us thought we were. We all thought that we would have to cheat, make the room feel smaller, but work in a bigger space.
Yeah.
And we got, we had the studio where we were going to build the room, and we got theater flats that were movable and a bunch of guys that would shift them for us. And we had lenses and a viewfinder. And we set up what we thought would probably be the size of the room, which would be about 20 by 20. Because in the book, it's about 11 by 10 or something.
Yeah.
Or 25 by 25, we set it up. And we stood in it, and we all immediately knew that it wouldn't work. That was too big. As soon as you looked at it, you just went, well, there's no story here at all. And then we started shrinking and shrinking it, and we got to the size of the room in the novel. Or it was slightly different. It was slightly longer and slightly thinner, because that allowed us to have two ends. But that was an amazing moment, because you just thought, we actually have to work in the room this small. We have to do it for real. And that was one of those things where you just know what the feeling is in your head, and you look at it and it doesn't match. And even though all of the logistics and all of the practicalities and everything that you would have thought as an experienced filmmaker would say, give yourself more room to work, let the camera suggest the smallness of it, we just knew, was experienced enough to know that that wouldn't work.
I mean, that must take some neck to be able to kind of go, you know, and I mean that in the best possible sense, to have all this thing, a lot of money, you know, a lot of,
a
lot riding on these decisions, and to trust that, it's extraordinary, trust that kind of hairs in the back of the neck, or whatever, that kind of.
Yeah, no, it's true. And I just know that if I don't have that feeling, or if I do have that feeling towards something, I have no compass if I let that go. Because why would I ever make one decision rather than another? I mean, the only thing that you do as a filmmaker, like you are in the work with the actors and the crew on set, you are trying to inspire and communicate and shape and help and like find ways in and all that stuff. But actually, a lot of the time, what you're doing is saying this or that, yes or no, and about a million things every day. And if you don't have some internal yes/no gauge, well, why would you ever go one way or the other? And then you're no use to anybody. So the only thing that marks that, like the only thing you have to have as a director is that impulse. Because if you don't have it, you float. And I think that will be terrifying.
Yeah. And then, I mean, there's a couple of things there. I mean, obviously you worked with actors throughout your whole career. Is that something that you really, in that sense, that kind of, because obviously in the end, they're the ones that are going to be carrying your tone. Yeah. Is that something that gives you great joy?
Great joy. It's my favorite thing. And I know that's not always true. And it amazes me that there are directors who are very like hyper technical, very good stylistically, and they're not particularly keen on the work with actors. And it can still work, because depending on the sort of work you're doing, they're like actors at a certain level are so skilled.
Yeah.
That they'll come in and they will produce, and you know, and directors will find a way of making that work really well. I love it. I love the conversation. I love the surprising things that actors will give you that you're not expecting. And they are the people that you're looking at. I mean, that, you know, in that most fundamental way, like all of that magic is what an actor brings. And I'm sure you feel the same. And I think in the theater, that's often more appreciated. And it's not as commodified as it is in film. But I really like that part.
And talk to me a bit about, we won't dwell on it, but kind of then what happened after Room, the explode. I mean, when did that start to kind of, you went in your head going, oh, Jesus Christ, okay.
Yeah, and this is the first time. I mean, it had bits of success before for sure and everything, but like success that people might be really remark. It was, I think, about 3/4 of the way through post-production on Room, and we went to New York to show a cut to our distributor over there, who had also put up quite a lot of money, and it's A24, who are this amazing company. They're the distributors behind Moonlight and loads of different films. But this was the first time they'd had a big awards contending moment. But we went over, and there were other people there as well. Film 4 were there, and we showed in a screening room in New York. And when the lights went up, there was just this sense that everybody was kind of, and it wasn't the finished version, but it was strong, and there was a real palpable feeling in the room. So we went off. The next day we had our meeting with, or later that day, had a meeting with the distributor, and they started talking about it in this way that I couldn't quite understand. They were saying, so do we think there may be an autumn release? And I thought, well, that's nice, but what's the big deal about, spring, summer? Great. And then you realize what that means in the States is, are we going to push for Oscars? That's entirely what it means.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to release it in the autumn if you're not, because it's such a busy time. All of the quotes awards contending films get dumped into the cinemas at the same time, and everything is more expensive, advertising is more expensive, everything, right? Because it's a big kind of bottleneck of quality quotes films. And amazingly, this brilliant woman there, Nicolette Eisenberg, she was their publicity person. It sounds like, oh yeah, just PR, but she's a genius. She said, and I heard Ed talking about this in Colorado, which is a sort of like, it's the place where the big movies often start, and they take 20 films. We'll go to Telluride, it'll catch fire there. We'll go from there to Toronto with the energy behind it. It'll win the audience award. We'll go out onto the screens. We'll have a campaign. It will get nominated. Blah blah blah. And we all said, "Oh my God, are you serious? Is this even how?" And actually, that's exactly what happened.
Yeah.
And it was that time. It was in their office that I realized their potential, because it's a huge machine and it's also very expensive for them to do that.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating because it's kind of that was the context which I meant. I mean, I think there's kind of, it seems to be no more than any kind of art form world, there's kind of two successful routes, in relation to the way the public or the industry sees it. There's awards through film festivals, there's awards, there's a kind of
circuit.
But then this one popped into the mainstream Oscar, Golden Globes.
Yeah.
And I suppose that seems to be, from the outside looking, at a very different animal completely. But that's the plan. That's a journey that has happened before, where you go from the festivals out into that. Yeah.
And when we won the Audience Award at Toronto, I think in the last 10 years, only one film that won that award didn't get nominated for Best Picture.
Okay.
So it's like there is, but then you have to go into this mad thing for like months, traveling around the world, going to parties, shaking hands, showing your thing at, Palm Beach or Palm Springs Film Festival. And you're on the circuit with all the other potential contenders. So you're kind of, and all these people that you are famous, and you've never, and you're sort of sitting there at breakfast because they're going to the same festival that night. That was really odd. But it was really that first screening in New York when they started talking in the office in A24 about awards. And I thought, this could be, and then when it started to, when all those boxes started to get ticked, and you realize, you're on that road.
I think surreal must be the word, but when sitting in the theater at the Oscar award ceremony, I can imagine that
I mean, bizarre. And the camera comes when it's your section, and they plan, and your face is in one of those boxes, and you're trying to look, A, wishing I'd lost loads of weight, B, thinking, shit, this is that moment. And I knew and then Brie won, and that was amazing.
But the wish to have the Frank head on you, kind of.
Oh, that would have been perfect.
Come here. Obviously, then it was a little stranger.
Yeah.
And again,
which had the opposite trajectory. But even though I'm incredibly proud of it, like, I'm really proud of that film. I think it will stand the test.
Yeah.
But it got released as a big horror movie, and I knew that was going to be a disaster. But I'm so proud of the work I did with Donal and with Lucinda Coxon and Sarah Waters and Ruth Wilson and all these amazing people. And I do think the film will stand the test of time.
But I think it's an interesting that kind of how something is released becomes out of your control in a way, kind of the higher you climb a certain ladder.
Yeah. And we, luckily I had final cut on the film, and that meant that it could stay being the thing I wanted it to be. but the distributor really decided, no, we're going to go for the mass market.
Yeah.
And I said, it's absolutely not a mass market film. If we'd done the same with Room would have died.
Yeah. So look, we're kind of up to date nearly on your work, and obviously, we're right here now in the middle of a coronavirus pandemic, and your Normal People is on episode 3 or 4, depending on what kind of channel one is watching it on. But we spoke before we kind of recorded about the fact that it very nearly didn't reach the end point.
Yeah, it was. I think the last pickups and things were shot about a week before we locked down.
Wow.
And we were, that close to it not happening, and it would have been so painful. I mean, and it is incredibly I mean, listen, the pandemic is painful for many deeper reasons than production company problems. But having said that, from our point of view, I know what it would have meant to us, and I know that there are a lot of other people whose things they've spent years working on are now up in the air. Things that were halfway shot are not completely finished in post. So very, very lucky that we got to bring it to people.
And again, this is another very, very popular book, very kind of book that's in the zeitgeist, very, and again, what was it that drew you to the project, Lenny?
I think in this case, it was something to do with that tone. That intimacy of tone, that intimacy between the characters, and the intimacy that the reader has with the characters. And an attraction to the idea, I mean, stepping back one level, an attraction to the idea of doing something on television which was not not involving itself in that arms race that seems to be going on at the moment for higher and higher concept things, and more and more like heightened and I suppose sensationalistic or kind of, people are designing shows around like what will be talked about, or things which are super high concept and glossy or dark, and this is about being true. And it will only work if you take all that away. It's scary in one sense, because the only thing that's left is this interesting or not? Does it feel real? Is it emotional? Is it emotionally powerful? And there's nowhere to hide. And that for me was, I think, that and the depiction of like the generation of the characters, that that crucial moment of young adulthood, like and going into adulthood, whatever that means, and the way Sally takes that seriously and renders it with compassion and depth. And then finally the thing of like being able to celebrate the beauty of sexual intimacy. Like, it's not without complication, but it is, to feel that it's possible to say this is a beautiful and incredible thing, and not to kind of pathologize it, which is what sometimes happens. Either sensationalize it on one hand or pathologize it on the other, and say, look at the kind of messed up relationships our kids are having or whatever. I thought that was just, there were so many reasons why it drew me.
I mean, I think that particularly is extraordinary. It's extraordinary for a number of different reasons. To be captured to that kind of deep yearning in the book, and I can't quite, and I don't want to figure out what that is, but it really affected me, and I've kind of managed to watch them all now, and just that sense of, I mean, you mentioned the childhood thing or the teenage thing, and I think that the glory of those years, and the kind of, in a way, you're right about the taking of them seriously, because in a way they're the most fully rounded, in the way those characters are, and they move away from that. Do you know what I mean? They kind of move.
Yeah, I mean, like, what do we think we become when we're older? We're of course there are things that we're we understand more, or there's a sort of wisdom, but I don't think there's anybody out there that wouldn't trade that wisdom for the intensity of experience that you have at that point in your life.
And in relation to, I mean, I suppose there's again, there's 6 hours of film there. It's a lot.
Yeah, massive. Yeah.
3 feature films, if you want to kind of.
Yeah, 3 feature films. Yeah.
But in a way that captures and allows the sense of, like, not much happens in the book, and I mean that from a crash bang.
No, absolutely. Yeah, totally. It's not full of event. Like, it's really, and I think if you try to put that on a feature, if you try to put that out in the cinemas, the expectation now in cinema is so much for like this something of scale, and not necessarily just in terms of action, but also, you know, it's radical on TV already. And actually, but actually the instinct that we had internally was, but in a way that actually could really capture people. I
Yeah.
think trying to put it on a cinema screen, it would have had a very small release. It would have been considered like super art house. And isn't it amazing that's how it would have been viewed?
Yeah.
By anybody taking it on as a film.
And
And at the same time, you can find an audience. So we just got the figures through, like this morning. I think there was a press release about it, but 16 million people
what?
watched it on the iPlayer.
Whoa.
In the UK.
That's extraordinary.
It's double. It's the highest number of people engaged with the iPlayer by a factor, like double. Basically, it's double the previously highest week.
Wow. And I think this tells me something really interesting in both the aesthetic, obviously, of the novel, but then how that was kind of, as I said, so gracefully remade, you know, with Sally being involved in the writing. And
absolutely central to it.
But that sense of the casting, and that sense of not just the two leads, but but a very Irish story. But there's something fascinating, and kind of interesting this throughout your whole work, is the absence of the behemoth of religion. Do you know what I mean?
I know.
But I think that's extraordinary, and it's extraordinarily beautiful. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of it's obviously there, but it's more like a statue you pass by carrying a super value.
Yeah, which was why I found I was sort of, in an odd way, there was a kind of sweetness and a silliness to for me, like in a nice way, to the live line thing.
Yeah.
Because it was great radio and all, and I know there are people who think that way, the way that the callers did, who didn't like it. But like that's not here anymore. You know, not in any real way. Not in any. I mean, it could come back.
Yeah.
Who knows what's going to happen in the world?
Yeah.
But I think the Ireland that myself and Mark started to describe back in 2004 or 3 when we made Adam and Paul was already a post-church Ireland, you know, and we didn't need to have that argument with them anymore, or that debate with them, and that was why we felt like free to leave behind those stories in a way. I think, you know, and that's good.
I think that's what's so extraordinary though about Sally's book, about the kind of the way it was made into this magnificent TV series. It is that, like, it's not, I don't mean radical in the big R, but the fact that it doesn't even matter. Do you know what I mean? It's not even.
It doesn't figure in those characters' lives. That's what was so amazing of hearing everybody going, it's fornication, it's pornography. Like, that's over. That they don't care about that way of framing their lives. It is irrelevant. And I think the society is all the better for that. I mean, that's easy between you and I. We can say that because, you know, I don't know one person in my orbit that thinks remotely in that way anymore.
I think it's also, I think, in relation to the intimacy. I mean, you kind of go back to, I don't at all mean this sexual intimacy. I mean, but going back to, say, Room.
Yeah.
There's that sense of, like, there are scenes there where you're kind of going, my God, I shouldn't be watching this, and I'm not, you know.
Yeah. No, I know what you mean. You like, that's the highest compliment to me, which is, if it can feel like I've removed the machinery between you and what's happening. If it feels like I've removed all the layers and barriers between you and what's happening. And it's, you know, and it's a tough thing to do. It's a hard thing to do, because obviously it is this mechanical process. Like, I always think about the fact that, you know, the writer has all of the beauty of a blank page is that every mark you make on it is significant. You know, every word you write. Whereas, like, the camera is so crude, really. Yeah. That's its glory. Like, it shows you pointed at something, everything goes in. Yeah. And it's like, and it's all it's the surfaces of things and the sounds and all. But, like, it's amazing. For me, the holy grail every time is to and you are stylistically inflecting that, but in ways I hope that are almost invisible. And what you feel, what that of the fully 3-dimensional presence of things is like to try to get better and better at finding how you do that, like how you, and every time it's a challenge. And it feels to me that the thing that people are responding to in Normal People is possible because it seems like you're having a real encounter with these characters and their relationship.
But I also think there's something about the way that it's been made, and I mentioned the word yearning earlier on. What really grabbed me about it was, is it makes you yearn for a life that you actually didn't live, or is it there's a nostalgic around?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's huge, and that's very novelistic. You know, that's very.
It is. Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I did not have a relationship like that at that age. I didn't. There was no. I was too. I was not open. I mean, none of you. It's not about the openness. I wasn't. I don't think I was kind of. I didn't grow up in a kind of family where there was a tremendous guilt around sex or anything like that. Not at all. But I was, for all sorts of other reasons, was not open to that sort of love at that age. And I think often a lot of nostalgia and yearning is for a thing that we didn't fully have.
Yeah.
You know, or didn't really experience fully in the first time.
Yeah.
You know, we only really experienced it in its roundness in memory.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's the Proustian idea, I suppose.
I mean, the most powerful moments in it are, and it sits now as a kind of quasi grown up. You kind of feel those moments of going, "That's not what they fucking said." Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, moment
I know.
No, you know.
No, I know. You do. We felt that even on the day. They were like, you know, Susie Lavelle, who's this brilliant cinematographer that I collaborated with, and she shot all my episodes. She's so empathetic, you know, but she'd be like, you turn around after the take and she'd either be crying or raging, you know, depending on who done what.
Yeah. And before I let you go, Lenny, I think as well, back to the joy of kind of working with actors. I mean, the performances that the two leads, it's extraordinary work, you know, really, really.
Yeah. And huge, like, shout outs to Louise Kiley, who cast it as well. She did such an amazing job. And then Daisy and Paul are just amazing actors. And, you know, that's the joy. The joy for me of working with them, seeing how brilliant they were. And I did say to them during it, and I wasn't the only person who said to them, you know, your lives will be different after this because the quality of the work is incredible. Didn't quite realize how much that would be true. Yeah. But they are remarkable, and the privilege of being there, being able to be the one to cast them and to set things up and create the tone of the thing was just, and then to work with somebody like Hetty, who's an amazing director. She brought her own instincts to the last half of the show as well. And that was, I think, to its benefit. Hard as it is to hand over.
I was going to say, like, I mean, were you working together, for a while, kind of?
Well, we talked a fair bit at the beginning, but actually, in a way, all I could do, and I think the only decent thing to do was to let her have complete access to the rushes and the rough cuts, and say that's what it is. You have to take your own journey with it. And I did have a role because I'm an exec producer across it, so I was watching all her cuts and able to make my, you know, give my notes and stuff like that. But I suppose the only thing I could do was show her the work and know that she would be delicate enough to be able to operate within that and still at the same time express herself.
And the delicacy for you of kind of, you know, you said tone of the act. I mean, to be able to, I mean, an awful lot of it shot in kind of first close up, you know, the kind of.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
And I just think, you know, the precision around what you're requiring those actors to do from, because what I love about it, again, it's very novelistic or, you know, cinematic and theatrical in a way, is it's by and large what's not said in that.
Yeah, it's that magical thing that you can sometimes have in film where the room seems to be present, the air is there, and you feel the time passing and the energy and the kind of feeling passing between the two characters, which it constantly blows my mind that can happen on this sort of mechanical medium. But you know, that's because we're people and so are they, and therefore so much of what's brought to it is brought to it by the audience. And part of the skill of the filmmaker is to allow the audience to do that, is to give them sort of for me, and this is the hardest thing to talk about how it works, but for me, it's often about how you are managing and creating a sort of intensity of focus in the viewer. That's really what is being worked on. That's the material really that you're working with. It's the orientation of the audience, the sense of questing, of needing to know, of understanding. It's sometimes putting people in a position which feels really present, but actually is slightly off center, which focuses the mind and the attention of the viewer and makes them sort of almost reach in and try and find it for themselves. That's more powerful than like directly presenting them with what you think is happening. So it's enough, but not too much in terms of what you're showing.
Yeah, that's brilliantly put. And Lenny, I'm going to leave you there. You've given me so much of your time, and
absolute pleasure.
Just say congratulations on Normal People, and it's you know, it will run and run, as the fella says. And hope to see you again soon when we're all released from our from our
cages. And congratulations on all the amazing work you do as well.
Thanks.
Really
all right. Thank you very much. All right.
Cheers.